I want everybody to welcome Michael Wiley. He is a thriller and mystery writer, as well as an educator. He's a professor at the University of North Florida. His most recent novel, Long Way Out, is the second book in his Franky Dast mystery series. The first book in the series is the Shamus Award-nominated Monument Road, yes, named after our Monument Road, about an exonerated death row inmate investigating the crime that sent him to prison. He also writes the Daniel Turner thriller series and the Shamus Award-winning Joe Kozmarski private detective series. He is also a frequent reviewer and an occasional writer of journalism, critical books, and essays. Michael will be joined in conversation with Mark Ari. Ari is an educator, writer, painter, singer-songwriter, and much more. At the University of North Florida, he directs a creative writing program. Ari authored the novel The Shoemaker's Tale and publishes fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And you can find his writings in Adult Journal, Heavy Feather Review, the International Journal of Professional Holistic Aromatherapy, which I found fascinating, and Music Gigs Gone Wrong, and more. He also has received several fellowships for his artistic projects. His paintings have been exhibited in Spain, France, and the US, especially in New York City. So Ari, I leave the rest to you.
Thank you. Hi, Mike.
Hey, great to be here. And thank you to Amani and to Allison and to Kate outside, everybody who has made this possible. And to you for coming.
So Mike, let's talk about Franky Dast. Okay, so we know he was arrested and forced to confess to 2 murders, arrested for the murder of 2 kids, 2 boys, and forced to confess or by an overzealous cop, this guy Higbee, right? He winds up going to jail for 8 years. 3 on death row, 5 in a super maximum security prison before he's exonerated. Then when he gets out, he catches the actual criminals. That all happens in the first book, Monument Road. When we meet him in The Long Way Out, he's already been out of jail for, I guess, a year?
About a year.
About a year, but he's still not free, is he?
You know, these are the kind of situations I can't imagine ever freeing oneself. In that first one, he ends up he gets out partly through his own initiative and partly through the help of an Innocence Project. We've got lots of those in the United States. Brian Stevenson has done extraordinary work up in Alabama and beyond nationally. And that was kind of my model for the type of law firm that was going to be helping him. He gets out of jail. He's been shoved into a really bad situation up front. This is in the first book, Monument Road. And he investigates the crime that sent him to prison and the cop, Higbee, who seemed determined to send him there. And that's the first one. He comes out, he figures out who has committed the crime, and a year passes. It's 5 years actually since Monument Road came out, and so this is fictional time compressed. It's kind of like COVID time when everything disappears. and so he's out looking for a job. He ends up with the job that we'll probably end up talking about. And through a series of events, he gets asked to look into a missing teenage girl after all the time that he's spent getting into trouble for the killings of 2 other roughly teenagers. He's kind of hesitant to get into this, but he ends up finding out that this girl has been killed, and through guilt and everything else, he's on the investigation. All kinds of other things happen along the way, but he's going to find his way.
So when we meet Franky in the new book, he's working at a big cat rescue place called Safe Haven. And his primary job is collecting chicken and animal carcasses to feed to the relentlessly hungry and tragically
Sounds like an awful book.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was a really exciting part, man. Yeah? So he feeds them to these out-of-place beasts in their cages. The thing about about Safe Haven is it also seems to be intent on saving people. And I wonder, what's the connection between Franky and the cats? It sounds like a rock and roll band, doesn't it?
Franky and the cats.
Is it the cage, the hunger?
Nothing. No, it's really the when I wrote the book, I was looking for a job where somebody who has a hard time dealing with people, which he does, having come out of prison, that he would be able to find a certain degree of pleasure, a certain degree of meaning, doing work that was meaningful, and this was the kind of place. We have places like the Caddy Shack, north of the city, and around Florida there are a lot of these big animal rescue kinds of places, and I'm modeling this roughly after that. As Ari said, this is run by a couple of women who then have taken in another person who seems to have kind of had to escape from the regular civilized life, and they end up hiring Franky to help out as well. Definitely, he's an injured big cat in some ways, but in other ways, this is a job that gets him through the days, enables him to pay his rent, and he wants to go forward that way. And so I don't see this as being a symbol so much as being a likely place for somebody like Franky to end up. I was also reading a lot of James Keane at the time when I was coming up with a good profession for him. And if you've read or if you know Postman Always Rings Twice, you'll know that cats play a really important part, including big cats along the way. And I was thinking a big cat rescue kind of a place would be just right for him.
Well, you say that there's not a big connection between Franky and the cats in terms of them. Well, let me put it this way. The cats are carnivorous. His job is to feed them carcasses. In a sense, Franky has his red meat too, isn't it? Doesn't he? His red meat is injustice. He can't leave it alone. When he first hears about the disappearance of Antonia Soto, he blows it off, figuring the 14-year-old ran away on her own, which 14-year-olds are wont to do from time to time. But then her body's found. She's taken a bullet to the back of the head, and it's as though it's his own snap judgment and the injustice of it that drives him throughout the rest of the novel. It's the energy that pushes him forward. Why can't he let go?
Again, the first time he got in trouble, the first time that he got sent to jail for a crime he didn't commit, it involved two young men, two teenage boys. And so he's the girl who disappears is working at this chicken farm, which is really interesting to research. But she's working for a family there, and she disappears. She's a little bit wild. It looks as if she's probably run away. The last thing he wants to get involved in is another situation that involves teenagers that he has very little connection to, where there might be a problem, especially when he thinks that there's nothing that really has occurred. When she turns up dead, this is a way of slamming into him all of the things that he has. He's failing his own responsibility in some ways. Even though of course he was innocent of these two earlier murders, in some ways he feels implicated in this one. He didn't look into this missing girl when maybe he thinks there was still a chance to have saved her. And so, the symmetries with the first story, you don't need to know the first story at all to read the second book. All the backstory gets established, but the symmetries with it, are definitely there. I don't know that any of us could feel good if we were asked to help somebody else out with a 14-year-old kid, say, and we said no, and then we learned that some kind of tragic, events had occurred. That's the situation he's in.
Well, let's stick with the idea of injustice for a moment. It's everywhere in the book. It's in Franky's forced confession and the subsequent hard time he did, and that continues to torment him. There are the 3 murders that he investigates and that he feels are connected by racism. There's racism itself. There's immigrant hatred. Your book seems to be as much a portrait of the character of our times as it is an exploration of character in Franky Dast. Is that incidental, simply the realistic setting in which your drama takes place? Or do you, as a writer, share some of Franky's response to injustice? Do you feel a responsibility to write about it?
Yeah, thanks. That's a real important question to me. My sense as a writer is that my first responsibility always is to tell a really good story, a story that keeps people awake at night, that people want to be turning the pages, people want to be finding out what happens, whether a hero who I love, and I hope my readers love, comes out on top. Whether he's going to get there or she's going to get there, they're going to get there. And that's always the first area of interest to me. if possible, and in a number of my books, I've found this to be possible, I love also to engage with things that really matter to me outside of the books, not as soapboxes to stand on, like just about every big issue that's in the news today. Part of the reality of our time is that they're complicated, right? They're complicated. Even to me, what the clear way to turn on some of these issues, say false incarceration, in this case with anti-immigrant abuse and discrimination, even if I think that it's real clear, there's a clear kind of a path forward. I recognize that there are, sometimes you take one path and you end up, in falling into a hole because there are other problems that emerge. And I try to get that as part of the story. Even as he's helping, to address injustice, people suspect that he might be motivated by the wrong motives, and to a certain degree he is. To a certain degree he is. But I really did want to deal with injustice, and especially in this one, the anti-immigrant kind of violence that we've seen, and so that was there. And this all comes from me personally. The question too was whether this is a deep connection out of a long sense that I've had that one of the worst things in the world to happen is to be accused of something that one hasn't done. To be faulted, to be punished for a crime or even a mistake that we haven't committed. And I've known, I remember being a little kid being accused of things that I hadn't done. If I'd done them, cool. You can punish me as much as you want. But if I hadn't done them, it just struck me as this extraordinary corruption in the universe. I mean, it was kind of bigger than life type of thing. And I'd always wanted to write that story. I'd always wanted to write that story, is something along those kinds of lines. And for the longest time, I'd published already 6 books by the time that I wrote Monument Road. I couldn't come up with the story, and it was really, reading all the news and following people about false incarcerations. It was reading all of those kinds of stories that got me, fascinated by the individuals. There's a lot of memoirs by these people, by the individuals who have been accused falsely, and that was the story that I knew that I could tell. I was asked immediately by my publisher to write a follow-up to that book. It ended up doing quite well, and I said, no, this is a one-off. They still published it as the first Franky Dast mystery when they published it, even though I said, no, this is going to be just the one. But after a few years, I realized that other situations in which people, for whatever reason, have been marginalized and have been kind of, violence has been committed against them, that this would be the kind of investigation that he could get into, and it wouldn't feel, to me, too implausible for him to get involved in. And so that's where that story came from. But yeah, this is very close to my heart. He's the character I've written, and I've written 4 different mystery and thriller series. He's the character who's closest to my heart.
That's interesting. You were talking about how it was personal to you to talk about being the situation of being accused of something that one is not guilty of. And in the book, it comes across almost as a trauma. I mean, he cannot let go of it. Everyone he meets, everyone he talks to, he rehashes the same experience, the same story. Is that, in a sense, making himself relive it all the time? Is that part of the traumatic experience?
I think especially for people who've been convicted of major crimes and have been in prison, that's, absolutely. They've been traumatized. And to me, he's a hero. He's my favorite kind of hero. He's a guy who has basically nothing to lose. And he's going to go out there, and he's willing to take a hit along the way toward achieving as much as he can achieve. I don't know that, for me, I haven't been traumatized. I don't wake up in the night screaming because I was punished for using my dad's saw. That was one of the things I got accused of. But damn it, no. I think it can range from those small injustices to the extraordinarily, enormous. And I think that, people who are involved in, any of us, I think we've all undoubtedly sometime been accused of something that we didn't do, usually small kinds of things. But I know, I know that, we implicate ourselves. A good friend of mine in high school, I grew up in a town, part of Chicago area that was not always real exciting, and just fell in with a group of kids who were looking for excitement, whenever we could, as teenagers often do. And some people were more willing to push the edge than others. And a couple of my friends started breaking into people's houses at night. That was a line that I was never going to cross, but there was 3 of them together who were doing this. And eventually, police figured out that they were the ones who were involved, and they accused them of a single burglary. And what happened in this situation is that all 3 of them confessed to having committed this burglary, and I knew that only 2 of them had actually committed that burglary, and I knew it because I was with the 3rd member on the night when this was done. But he went ahead and confessed, and so again, Franky Dast confesses to the murders that he's charged with after a lot of pressure. This is the kind of psychological complexity that really interests me in these kinds of things as well, is that even when we're not guilty, sometimes people push themselves into a situation or implicate themselves in these kinds of things. Franky Dast, on occasion, is kind of self-destructive. At least he does things that are going to hurt him as much as help him. And I think that's part of whether it's the trauma or human nature. We don't always do things that are in our own interests, and that fascinates me.
Well, I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, because I also find him an admirable character, or at least I admire him. I don't know if he's always admirable. He screws up a lot. He makes some really bad decisions. He blows off things. He promises people things and then goes back on those promises. Is that part of, maybe that's part of what makes him so attractive? He's more like us. With all his screw-ups and all his backsliding, in a sense, he still sticks to the need to find justice.
Yeah, he's, one thing you could say about him is he always does his best. Sometimes with very, very few tools, sometimes with, very, very little to work with, but he's always going to do his best. And he finds a way, which is one of those things that intrigues me as well, is that no matter what, I don't know. I hope that we don't share too much with Franky Dast. If you've experienced half of the stuff that he's experienced, I'm sorry. But what I do like to think is that there's a certain kind of resilience. That at the core we're going to keep on going, and when we're pushed all the way to the edge, we find a way to grip that edge and pull ourselves back up, and that's Franky Dast.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about some of the stuff that intrigues you, that compels you to write the character Franky Dast the way you wrote him, intrigues you about the things that you want to explore in the book. What is it that, let's talk more generally now about your writing, about what drives you as a writer. How did you find your way to crime writing? What is it about this genre that continues to excite your imagination?
I'm one of those kids who grew up reading mysteries. I don't know what you all grew up reading, but by the time that I was about 8 years old, I had anthologies of the real case, or the real case files of the FBI. I had a subscription to Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, and so this was the stuff that I was reading at a very young age. And I grew up in a family that read this as well. My mother was an addict. She was a 1 book a night reader, no matter what. She had, it was a mystery a night, and if she didn't have time during the day, she would read late into the night, and she'd be up at 6 a.m. the next day anyway. And so I grew up with that, and I grew up loving it. By the time that I was high school into college, in many ways I was kind of shoving that aside, thinking that this wasn't the serious reading. This wasn't the kind of reading that I was supposed to do. And I found a lot of books and a lot of ways of writing that I hadn't known about before, and that I deeply, deeply love. Enough that I went on to graduate school, and that I teach literature in college. And so that's there too. Eventually, though, my wife and I had been together for nearly 15 years, when in the space of 2 years we had 3 kids. That included twins. But suddenly all of the time that I had to devote myself to intense kind of work on literary study, it was just gone. It was just gone. And so I started picking up some of the stuff that I knew would just give me pleasure. And these were those old crime novels that I had read, and I immediately fell in love again with the form. And at that point I thought, I can write this. And so I started writing them again. I'd done a lot of writing as a kid, and a lot of writing as a young man, but this is what sent me back into it. I love crime stories, especially private detective stories, and stories that don't center on, say police or FBI, people who have institutional power behind them. These are the stories where you have the individual who are, they're out there kind of fighting the good fight. And sometimes that fight involves not working with the system, but fighting the system. Sometimes it involves, aligning with the system, but it's the one person who is kind of trying to find a way, either to what looks like standard justice, or maybe something that is an alternative to it, but maybe feels even higher. I just love those stories.
Well, you're talking about the stories that you love, crime in general, and the kinds of stories that you like. Are there particular authors that were inspiring to you, that you perhaps at least at some point began to model yourself after before you found your own voice?
Raymond Chandler is number one. There's just no question. Raymond Chandler is the great-great-grandfather of probably 30% of crime writers writing today. That's where so many of us got our start. And it's, again, Chandler, Big Sleep, Farewell My Lovely, those are the 2 most popular books, made into multiple movies, writing in the later part of the first half of the 20th century. Incredible poetry in his writing, incredible dialogue, incredible hero. Again, this is one of those guys, again, who is working sometimes alongside of the police and the DA, sometimes against them, always working on a complicated kind of a mystery. And so, he has a voice that's been very important to me. In terms of somebody like Franky Dast, the much more direct line would be somebody like James Lee Burke. And I'm not sure how many of us know James Lee Burke's books, but he mostly spends his time in Idaho now, though he is from the New Orleans area, and sets his books in the New Iberia area as well. And Dave Robichaud, his detective, was a former police officer who now is working on his own. And his books, in ways that I hope my books to a certain extent do as well, really evoke the place where they're written, and just have a kind of a richness of environment. You never have to go to Louisiana to experience Louisiana if you read his books. His Dave Robichaud books are really terrific. The list beyond that is enormous. I've learned from everything I've read, but those are probably 2 of the writers who've been closest to me.
Mike, I want to talk more about this, maybe move into some of the directions that crime writing has taken today. But one thing you said when you talk about the lyrical writing or the poetry in Chandler's work, which made me flash on the long way home, long way back. The long way out, excuse me.
Long way out.
I got it.
It's a long way to the title.
It's a long way to get it down.
That's right.
But the most lyrical writing in the book, I thought, had to do with when Franky Dast takes out was it the French horn? Mm-hmm. And I thought it was absolutely beautiful because the writing itself became truly poetic. There were beautiful passages.
Thank you.
And the guy can't blow the horn at all, which I thought was a wonderful contrast. I don't have a question about it. I just wanted to mention it.
Yeah, Franky Dast's grandfather played the French horn. He more or less inherited that French horn, learned how to play stuff from Star Wars when he was in middle school.
But not well.
Not ever well. But then when he was in prison, The music of the French horn stuck with him, stuck with in his memory. And when he came out, he picked it up again, not very successfully.
Well, he can't blow the horn at all, but somehow when he's blowing it, at least from my reading of the book, there's a recurring theme in the book, a motif about just living. And it seems to me that's when for this reader, is when he becomes really alive, in contact, in an open way to the world around him and to his life. They're really rather beautiful passages.
Thank you.
So we talked about some of the influences that have affected your writing. What about some of the other people that you know that are writing crime fiction today? Who's doing the most interesting work, and who's inspiring you?
Has anybody been reading Sean Cosby, Essay of Cosby? We've got 1, 2. If you haven't read Blacktop Wasteland or Razorblade Tears, he's not a young writer, but he's a writer pretty new on the scene, just burning up everything that he does. Extraordinary writer. And again, this is one of the pleasures that I take in some of the best crime writing. He's not always perfect. Every now and then, he'll play a bad note, but when he hits right, you won't find anything that's more emotionally drawing, anything that's more exciting than the things that he's writing now. S.A. Cosby, spelled Cosby the way that you'd expect, is doing really, really terrific work. One of the things that's happening right now, and we can say it's about time, is there's a great deal of diversification in crime writing. And so we're hearing from voices, and we're seeing writers published who historically would not have been published, and that's a great deal of a pleasure as well. Another writer I would turn to, and her last book came out a little while ago, is Steph Shaw. It's C-H-A, and her book is Your House is Going to Fall. I think that's close to it. Your House is Going to Fall. And again, this is a writer who is dealing with kind of split narratives, split time out in Los Angeles, and she's a terrific writer as well. Again, the list could go on and on, but those would be 2 writers I would definitely recommend that you find on the shelves or find in the bookstore, wherever you get your books, sooner rather than later.
When you were talking about some of the writers that you like, you used a musical metaphor. Then we have this wonderful batch of lyrical writing that takes place in the book when it has to do with music. Is this something that are you a frustrated musician?
No.
Okay. Shot in the dark.
Yeah, no. This is my moment of my big reveal. Is the last instrument that I played, and I quit when I was in 2nd grade, was the auto harp. And so, and anybody who's not into auto harp knows that you want to stick away from me, which is to say, everybody. And even if you are into auto harp, you want to go elsewhere. So, no, I'm not.
You played auto harp?
I played the auto harp.
Okay. In what grade?
Up until, I fell in love with auto harp when I was in kindergarten. I heard it, and I went home, and I told my mother, this is my future. This is what I've always wanted to be, an auto harp player. And so I was the youngest auto harp player in the village school of music, and I learned how to play, Alice's Restaurant and other things like that. They wouldn't teach me the song from the Partridge Family, all of that, though I really, really desperately wanted it. And so, by the time that I was in 2nd grade, I realized I'd hit my limit, and I was out. So no.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that you thought at least at one point that Monument Road might be a one-off. And of course now it's not. Your publisher wanted another book, but it took 5 years to get to this one. And I guess that's because you still had things to explore with Franky Dast. Do you feel like you've exhausted Franky Dast, or?
No, I think that he might be exhausted himself. I think that he needs 5 years to recover. Between Monument Road and this, I wrote a series of books featuring a Chicago PI named Sam Kelson, and the Sam Kelson books are set in a very different environment, and he's a very different kind of detective, a whole lot lighter, and maybe a whole lot more fun. but the enjoyments, the pleasures that I get out of Franky Dast are, I'd say, richer ones. I wouldn't want to return to him until there was a story that I think he belongs in. So 5 years from now, Franky Dast #3.
Okay, so the Franky Dast mysteries take place in locally, Jacksonville.
They do.
The other series that you were just talking about takes place in Chicago. Both terrains that you're familiar with. You grew up in Chicago. You live here in Jacksonville now. Is there a big difference for you in using these environments?
Yeah, it's in some ways, again, a good story is a good story is a good story, and that's what I'm aiming to write. And so those happen, any place. I've written two series in Chicago. The first one was Joe Kozmarski, and Amani deserves great credit for getting Kozmarski's name right. Most people struggle over that. He's a Polish-American detective in a city that is deeply Polish. Those are both private investigator novels. The pace is quick. The setting is important, but it's not something that we kind of have longer sentences getting into. The characters, it's just too cold to kind of move leisurely in Chicago. And so things happen fast. Those are, I like to think, really fast reads. I wrote a series of books. First one was Blue Avenue, second of them, Second Skin, and third one, Black Hammock, that are set here. Those are under the group name of the Daniel Turner Thrillers. Daniel Turner is a police officer who appears in all three of those books, but he's always a secondary character. They're narrated by other characters, and so he's the common point in all of those. And those are set here. And again, these have something of the Southern Gothic in them. They definitely are getting out in the wetlands, and they're getting into the water, and they're getting in the heat of a place like this, and that changes the way people talk. It changes the way people move, and that changes the way that a story moves as well. I think always that I've got it backwards because my books set in the north are a little bit brighter, in a place that we think of, being dark half of the year, and my books set in the Sunshine State get into some pretty dark areas, and that's true of both the Daniel Turner books and now the Franky Dast ones.
What's on your mind these days?
What's on my mind these days? I'm always writing. And so I'm trying to right now. I'm writing some longer books, bigger books. That in some senses go north and south and south and north. Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, there's a character, he's a really mean guy who's very murderous, guitar banes. And Song of Solomon is set up in the Detroit area, but eventually they come south, which is where his family and the main family who feature in that book are from. This is a long way of saying that he gives a line there that has stuck with me always, and it's this: when his friend says, north, south, what's the difference? He says, I do believe my whole life is geography. And I think there's something to that. The place when we're writing crime fiction is really, really crucial. It's kind of a cliche to say that setting is another character in crime fiction, but in very real ways, it is. So I've written northern books, I've written southern books, and so what I'm really interested now is kind of a United States book. What is it to go from Jacksonville to Chicago to New York to Jacksonville, to Wisconsin. I haven't gone really west of the Mississippi. I'm just sticking to the area that I know. But I'm fascinated by the shifts that those kinds of travels bring with us, those migrations, those movements.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions from folks in the audience for you. Why is his name Franky Dast? How'd you come up with that name?
Yeah, I don't know. That really is true. One of the things that I frequently do with my books is I will name a character, and then about halfway through my writing of the book, I will realize that name doesn't fit, and I will rename the character.
Did you do that with this one?
I did not. Franky Dast, I had that name very early on, and there's something, especially in the last name, there's something in that word Dast, which I have never met anybody named Dast. I don't even know if it's a real last name, but I like the shortness, I like the roughness, I like what it, Dast. It seems like something that you'd say instead of swearing. Like when you cut your hand or something, Dast. And so Franky Dast lives a kind of a Dast-like life. But it's also, it feels very real to me too. The Franky, is not Frank Dast, but Franky, so there's something of the child in it as well. But we also have the Franky who can be kind of the hard-boiled Franky. And so it was one of those names that stuck with me right away. We've also, my family, we've got a history of also renaming each other and our pets. We had a cat that we originally called Alia, and she turned out to be the nastiest, meanest cat. She was nothing like Alia, so we renamed her. And then my second son, I've got 3 kids. My younger son, when he was born, we called him Simon. And that night, I went to sleep. We thought about that and one other one, and we said, we were getting it on all the records, and I got home and said, nope, it can't be Simon. So his name is now Elias. I think he would have been happier with Simon sometimes, but his name is Elias, and so so I'm very ready to change names. If you don't like Franky Dast, let me know.
I'm never calling you Mike again. Okay, this is this is for me. So okay, it's not a question. It was a message to me. I'll share the message. If you've ever had a class with Wiley, you know he's into lyrical prose. Okay. When writing about topics of violence and abuse, how do you discern between realistic depiction and exploitation?
A wonderful question. I just published an essay. Anybody, if you ever want to go to Facebook and find it, you can easier way. There's a major website called Crime Reads. It's the central one that deals with crime writing, crimereads.com. And if you just do a search for Wiley, you'll see that there are 2 Wileys. One is somebody else, and then you'll see one with kind of like a flashing kind of siren light kind of a thing. And there's an essay that I wrote that is based upon a murder that happened. I live in San Marco, and it's based on a real murder that occurred just across the street from me. I mean, I was the second person. My wife and I were the second people kind of on the scene after the body was found. And I struggle with that. I struggle with that, and I think that most crime writers do. Actually, I'll say the crime writers I respect, struggle with those questions of what entertainment versus exploitation, and so facing real death versus fictional death is a real kind of tricky thing, and it is. I'll just say shortly that it's something that I think that we work over all the time. Without going into politics, without doing anything other than that, the people I know who write crime, who write violence, I would guess that 90%, maybe higher, are very, very pro-gun control, are very, very anti-violence of any kind, oppose the death penalty, and on and on and on. And explain it to me. I don't know. Maybe we get all of our violent urges out on the page, and so we don't carry that over into other kinds of places. But I think it's a really interesting question. And of course, there's the question of you write violence. Does that soften our own resistance to violence? All of these other kinds of things that I think are really interesting questions. I don't have the answer. I don't have an answer. I will say that I love reading crime. I love watching crime shows, movies, television series, and of course I love writing crime stories as well. But I think that in some ways it's all about facing down those questions of of things that are very often inexplicable, right? The inhumanity of violence becomes something that we want to deal with one way or another. What's the line between exploitation, which is to say entertainment, violence and abuse as entertainment, and the real thing? I hope that there's a huge wall, not just a line between those two. But I recognize again that these things can be complicated.
Thanks, Jim. Have you been influenced by writers such as Stuart Woods, Carl Hiaasen?
Carl Hiaasen, yes. Stuart Woods, less. I'll say that Carl Hiaasen, especially, again, Stuart Woods, terrific writer. No question about it. Carl Hiaasen has interested me for the way that he uses humor, in all the best crime writing, and this includes the very darkest. There's an edge of laughter. Whether it's laughing at ourselves or laughing at the darkness, or sometimes, as in Carl Hiaasen. If you don't know Carl Hiaasen, again, the Florida writer, as is Stuart Woods, Carl Hiaasen being somebody whose whole stock and trade is humor, writes very funny mysteries. We can all use some laughs. I like Hiaasen, and he's taught me, in some of, especially my Chicago books, that kind of humor can play. And of course, Florida.
What's your writing process? Do you sit down and write for long stretches, or write at the same time of the day?
Yes, no, yes. People often say, how do you get the writing done? And the answer finally is a really easy one, is that you write every day. If that's only a couple of sentences, you do a couple of sentences a day. If it's, for 4 hours, great. I'm like a lot of people I know who write professionally. I'm a morning writer, and so I will get up so as to put in at least a couple of hours of writing before whatever else I have to do. So if it means that I've got commitments at 9 o'clock, then I'm up at 5 a.m. and I'm writing. If they're earlier ones, I'll get up still earlier. Very often, it just means getting up at 6 and writing for a couple of hours before doing anything else. And then through the day, when I have a half an hour here or half an hour there, I'll continue to write 7 days a week. In the summer times when I don't teach, often 6-7 hours a day. During times when I do teach, I try to get at least 3 or 4 hours of writing in each day. And the pages happen. And so it's just a matter of doing that. The writing process is, again, this seems like a non-answer, but write, just do it when you can.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I'd like to know what you, it's a little difficult to read this one. I'd like to know what you would attribute the current uptick in mysteries across, to what you would attribute the current mysteries, the uptick in interest in current mysteries across the board: books, movies, TV, cozy mysteries, clever screenplays. Then it has some examples, I guess. Only Murders in the Building, Glass Onion.
Yeah, the easy answer, and I don't know if this is, nobody's tested it out, but it feels right to me, is that in times when the nation, when more local areas, when we're facing crises, historically, detective fiction especially, but mysteries and not so much thrillers, but mysteries, have been very popular. And I think it has to do, again, with the same reason that I suggested I like writing these stories, is it's a way of working through the unknown, right? Working through problems and coming to usually a solution. Now, there once upon a time, every mystery had to, have an arrest, or at least stopping the perpetrator, meeting some kind of a justice. Now that doesn't always happen, especially in streamable TV, where you might have 8 seasons before we, deal with, with Walter in Breaking Bad. But these kinds of things where we would be working toward a kind of conclusion, and I do think that that's part of it. We want to see people who work out problems and get to some kinds of solutions. Beyond that, I don't know. I just like to think that everybody is finally coming to their senses and finding a really cool genre.
How do you have or make time for so much reading and writing, and also teaching and everything else life entails?
Just again doing it. I'm not very happy sitting around. In some ways, I know that I should be, but I'm not. And my family, if I'm sitting around, gets really annoyed at me because then I start trying to control the universe, which is to say their universe. I'm happier, and everybody else is happier around with me if I'm sitting at the keyboard, typing books or teaching or doing whatever else. To a certain degree, I'm being, flippant here, but really it comes down to just again prioritizing the writing. I think it's really the writing that is at the core of this question often, is that how do you get the writing done when you have all of these other things to do? And my own sense is that every excuse that I've ever had for not writing, and every excuse that I've ever heard from anybody else for not writing, has been an excellent excuse. Every one of them, right? I've got kids to take care of. I've got to cut the lawn. I've got to do all of these other things. Every one of those. That's true. And then the question is, well, are you going to let the kids starve, or are you going to write the book? No, I'm kidding. Are you going to cut the lawn? Are you going to cut the lawn, or are you going to write the next book? Next couple pages, knowing that pretty soon after writing those next couple of pages, you're going to need a break, and you go out and cut the lawn, right? And so, just saying, I know all those other things matter, but this is what I do.
Okay, now I got to warn you. This one comes with a preface. It says it's an odd question.
My favorite kind.
Okay. I prefer reading thrillers, mysteries, crime stories. Sometimes, though, I feel guilty-ish for not reading great literature and classics. Should I read those books too, or just stop feeling like I'm missing out on important literature?
Give yourself a break. No, I love it all. I love it all. As again, I teach literature courses too, and I came into teaching through literary study. And so I think that those great books matter, but I also think that mysteries and thrillers and all of the other genre fiction, the beach reads, those matter too, right? Those matter too. And so my own attitude is that I don't feel any guilt at all for not having read, certain books that I really know I should have read. War and Peace, I'm not getting to it. I'm just not. Anytime soon, maybe sometime 20 years. No, and so I think that finding what we want, but also being open, to me. No, I feel no guilt. No hierarchies.
Okay, well, this next one is not a question. It's purely for your illumination. Colloquially, your mother might say, "You dasn't do that." So maybe Franky Dast what others dasn't.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking. I mean, I hadn't thought about dastard before either, because dastard is there too. There's all kinds of play that one can do off of it. No, I was going to start playing, but no. Yeah, maybe that is kind of a southernism, isn't it?
I guess. How real are the settings, like the place where we're going back to the book now? How real are the settings, like the place where Rooker lives, the farms where he works, the place where Antonia's body is found, etc.?
Yeah, my goal, again, as I said before, story first, and then everything that one can get accurate to the degree that one can get it accurate. There's a lot that's true to life. Early in the book, I have Franky Dast remembering a conversation he had with his reintegration therapist, who was trying to get him to kind of take a step at a time, be grounded and all the rest. And he talks about a time when he was young and he was running and he saw a wild pig, and he was supposed to stand his ground, not run away, because then you get chased. But he ran away anyway, and eventually he breaks through some scrub and he comes to some tabby ruins, and the sun is shining through it, and he thinks for a moment it felt like he saw heaven. That's a real place. If you go out to the Seven Creeks area, the Cedar Point Trail, there's a place where you can see this old tabby ruins. It's built late 18th century. Is a slave plantation for salt, but there's still some of those ruins remaining. Whenever I can, I try to keep those places true. The chicken farm is not true, but all of the chicken work, is that a word? All of that is true. I spent a couple of hours interviewing a chicken farmer. He's up in Alabama, and we talked in detail. I had done a lot of research online. What you don't want to read about chickens, but the reality is that the chickens, the chickens are in the background, but get it right if you can. And so he helped me out to make sure that kind of the setting felt right. The kind of setup that we've got felt right. So whenever possible, I try to make it real. Monument Road, of course, is real. The places sometimes renamed. You will recognize the places on Phillips Highway. You will recognize some of the other kinds of places as well, sometimes renamed, sometimes not. But yeah, this is, I think that most people will read this who know Jacksonville and will know that this is Jacksonville. That was one of my goals.
Yeah, he says the chickens are in the background, but there are dead chickens all over this book.
No.
Two-parter for you. I find it interesting, given my background, not my background, but the questioner's background, my background working for Lutheran Social Services here in Jacksonville, that you focused on immigration issues. Why did you choose illegal immigrants as the victims in this story? Then I've got a part two for you.
Lutheran Social Services, again, being one of the groups who've done extraordinary and very important work with immigrants. I kind of started into this a little bit, but as I looked around, and let me back up a little bit. When I started thinking about the possibility of writing this plot, it was really when we were, as a nation, I won't include us all as bricklayers, but when the walls were going up, when there's more and more of this kind of conversation, when more and more people were being challenged at the border, and there were attempts to get, unwelcome populations excluded from kind of any immigration at all, and again, along with false incarceration, false convictions, it just struck me as extraordinarily inhumane. As this kind of a line to draw. This population can come in, that population cannot. And for me, that was a really important kind of a motivator. Once we're here, there's a great deal of anti-immigrant violence, and a great deal of bias, of course, as well. And it struck me that this would be a group of people who would have something in common with Franky Dast. Franky Dast, born and raised in Jacksonville. Aside from his 8-year vacation at Rayford, he's a Jacksonville person, but he's also an outsider, right? He's an outsider, and so while I wouldn't necessarily see the big cat environment, the safe haven as being a kind of a metaphor and an analogy to him, I do see the immigrant population that he's working with as being, in some ways, temperamentally, or not temperamentally so much as situationally in common.
Well, you've already answered the second part of the question, which was, do Franky Dast and the immigrants have something in common?
Yes.
Okay. What role have libraries played in your life and writing, and do they still matter?
Yes.
What are you going to say?
Yes. I hate libraries. No. No. In every way, libraries. This is home, right? This is home, and each place where I've lived, library has been home. I lived for 7 years in New York City, and the research division, the one with the enormous lions out front, there was no place in New York aside from the apartment where I lived that felt as welcoming and as much like the place where I needed to be. With apologies to anybody who loves to read electronic, I want my paper. And I love the smell of a library. I love the feel of a library. I've done, I don't know how to say it other than that. Anytime that I have an opportunity to do things with libraries, I do. And so, yes, I'm a big supporter. Libraries matter. And I think, in different ways now from in the past, continuing to, with electronic kind of media, of course, we're seeing libraries take whole new roles from the past. And so, yeah, support our libraries.
Okay.
And I really, really, really hate what's going on with the little classroom libraries in Duval. If you haven't seen, the restrictions that are taking place, pick up the newspaper. But the kind of efforts to come for the books, frightening.